Hi, everyone. We'll be waiting 2 to 3 minutes before starting the webinar to accommodate for the rest of the attendees who are in the middle of connecting. And while waiting, we're curious to know what is your biggest security problem today. And I'll be posting a link here on the Q&A chat room with a link to poll EV survey that you can go and provide your answer. Well, thank you so much for submitting your security problems, and this is why we're here for. We'll go over and look at them and start from there. Thanks for joining, and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valen Kolika, and I'll be your host for today. A few reminders before starting. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. You'll still will be catching up with us as the webinar go live. And plus, we will be providing a recording for this webinar. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. And we will post the recordings in our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. All the links that I'll be mentioning, you'll see them on your Q&A window. During this time, please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A by clicking on the Ask a Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. We often get many questions on these webinars, and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event, if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post the event, and you can do so by raising it in our forum, Azure Sentinel forum, that is, at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. If you're listening to this after the fact as a recording, that's also a great place to ask a question. And we love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars. And you can do so by providing your feedback at aka.ms/security-webinar-feedback. While you're there, please join our community by visiting aka.ms/security-community, which is the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews, which you can sign up for at aka.ms/security-private-preview. And while you're there, you can request features, give feedback, or review our product roadmaps, attend in-person events, or join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is simply by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. Today, we'll go over threat intelligence automation with the RiskIQ and Azure Sentinel, of course, with Jason and Brandon. Jason Westcott is a principal program manager with our Azure Sentinel team, whereas our guest speaker today is Brandon Dixon, Vice President of Strategy at RiskIQ. And without further ado, I will turn it over to them. Jason, Brandon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Valen. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And I would appreciate if you share your deck so we can pick it up from there. Thank you so much.
There we go.
Good to go.
See this, hopefully?
Yes.
Great. So let's start with a little bit of introductions. I thought it would be good for folks to see who is presenting today. So my name is Jason Westcott. If you're a regular with these Azure Sentinel webinars, you may have caught the last webinar I did on threat intelligence back in March. I'm a principal program manager with Azure Sentinel. My team is responsible for everything related to threat intelligence in the Azure Sentinel product. So we spend a lot of time talking to partners such as RiskIQ and Brandon. We spend a lot of time talking to customers, previewing new features. We have a very active private preview program with Azure Sentinel, as you are hopefully aware. So flighting a bunch of new features. Everything to do with TI comes through my team. So anybody who has questions related to TI, don't hesitate to reach out through the Azure Sentinel tech community. Brendan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jason. So my name is Brandon Dixon. I run strategy for RiskIQ. And prior to joining RiskIQ, I had created a startup with my co-founder, Steve Ginty, called Passive Total, that was later acquired by RiskIQ. So that product continues to function today. It's our threat intelligence and analyst offering for RiskIQ. So my duties have changed quite considerably. I do more partnerships and looking at the strategy of the business today, but still very much deeply connected to stopping bad actors from doing malicious things on the internet.
Great, thanks, Brendan. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I don't know exactly where everyone's at when we do a webinar like this. So your level of experience with Azure Sentinel, how far deep into the product you've explored. So I always thought it's good to start kind of level setting when we talk about threat intelligence and just kind of talk about, review some of the basics that we went over on our last webinar before we get into the actual new stuff with RiskIQ and the enrichment scenario. So I thought it would be good to start with kind of breaking down the use cases for threat intelligence in kind of two main categories. The first is the scenario that we covered last time, which is really about using data connectors to acquire threat intelligence from your existing feeds or your threat intelligence platform products that you've integrated with Azure Sentinel, marrying those threat indicators with your logs in the form of threat analytics and producing insights. This is kind of the traditional SIM model for using threat intelligence, matching it with your event data, producing security insights that your security responders can take action upon. What we're going to talk about today, though, in great detail, is this new pattern that RiskIQ has come up with through automation playbooks in Azure Sentinel, using threat intelligence from massive data sets that are really so huge that they're really impractical to try to import into your SIM, and instead reaching out from Azure Sentinel to take insights that have been generated within the product and actually enrich those with RiskIQ insights. So you've got kind of this incidence with a star on the right hand side, which is an enriched incident. So your security responders have a lot more potential insight immediately when they first open up the incident and take a look at it. It's not just about the security alert, it's about additional context that's been added to that incident. So just real quick to review for folks that are unaware, Azure Sentinel itself doesn't ship with threat intelligence contained within it. You have to bring your own threat intelligence to the product, just like you bring all of the rest of your security data to your Azure Sentinel. And so you do that just like you do with other data types through data connectors. And we have two data connectors in Azure Sentinel today. The first is called Threat Intelligence Platforms. And this is the connector you'll use when you're using a threat intelligence platform known as a TIP. We have some logos here of products, very common products that enterprises are using to curate threat intelligence feeds from a great many places, decide where they want to disseminate that threat intelligence to different security products. And so if you're using one of these products, some of these are actually free, some of these are paid. But you can, they have built-in integrations with Azure Sentinel properly right in the product, so you can input your Azure Sentinel information into the product and enable this data connector, and you'll be getting your threat intelligence imported right into Azure Sentinel. The second data connector style is called Threat Intelligence Taxi. This is a proper Stix and Taxi client. So Azure Sentinel comes with a Taxi client. Taxi is a protocol. Stix is a data format, and both of these protocol and format are used to transmit threat intelligence. It is pretty much the de facto kind of open source standard for the transmission and storage of threat intelligence today. So we have taken a bet on it, and we are highly encouraging all of our threat intelligence partners that we're working with to take a bet on Stix and Taxi. So through Azure Sentinel, you can use this connector to connect to any Stix and Taxi server that is a version 2 or 2.1. 2.1 was recently ratified in March, so those are the current standards. And some of these products, like ThreatStream, for example, you can connect to, or MindMeld, you can connect either through the platforms connector or through the Taxi connector, because these platforms actually support both. So lots of different options. So once you've imported threat intelligence into Azure Sentinel, I thought it might be good to show you exactly where it lands. So like all of your other data, it lands in an area of the product called logs. The log name for Azure Sentinel is called Threat Intelligence Indicator. Threat indicators are the type of threat intelligence that is most useful to a SIEM, and right now that is the threat intelligence type that we support in Azure Sentinel. You can see an example on the right of a file hash type of indicator representing some malware. This particular file hash comes from a feed that we produce called the Microsoft COVID-19 threat indicator feed. You can read more about that on our GitHub site. Our tech community has a blog related to this as well. If you're interested in acquiring this feed, there's instructions on how to do so. So once you've got threat intelligence into the product, right, the most important thing you want to do with those threat indicators is actually match those to your raw logs to make sure that your environment is not seeing any activity related to any of that threat intelligence that you brought. And so the way we do that is through analytics. And our Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center team, affectionately known as Mystic, produces these built-in detections right out of the box. So as soon as you fire up Azure Sentinel, you can look through your analytics templates and you'll see more than 20 templates related to threat intelligence matching with your security data. And so what we've done is we've taken like the known indicator types that we work with: domains, emails, file hashes, IP addresses, and URLs. And we match those with various event logs in Azure Sentinel as appropriate. So for example, you'd see your domains matched to your DNS logs. You might have IP addresses matched, IP indicators matched to your DNS logs as well. So I've kind of put this table of threat indicator type and event type. The list of rules, analytics rules that we've got in the product is kind of a matrix of indicator type times event type. Not every indicator is appropriately matched with every event type because some of these event logs don't have that particular indicator in them. For example, like your DNS logs may not have file hashes in them, so we don't have any analytics related to that, but you kind of get the idea. All of those rules kind of follow the same pattern of taking all of your threat intelligence of a given type and matching it to a particular event type. So these are well-known logs, these event types in the product, but if you have a different kind of event log, if you've got your card swipe data or your Okta data or something in here that's not listed, it's fairly easy to take one of the existing rules. These are all scheduled rule templates, so you can take one of these rules and easily modify it to point away from the log type that was in the template to begin with and point it instead to a different log type. And the pattern still holds true. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brandon to talk about this new enrichment pattern that I talked about on the first slide and kind of the new use cases for threat intelligence that he's introducing.
Thanks, Jason. So just before we, Jason and I, when we were talking about what to show in this webinar, we felt it would be really helpful to actually just illustrate the activity of deploying a playbook and looking at analytics and seeing the RiskIQ playbook actually in action. Before we get into the demos, just a very quick introduction on RiskIQ for those who may not be familiar. So we're an attack surface management company. We've largely been technology focused, so we collect data at scale. We have a combination of different ways of doing that: a global proxy network. We perform internet scanning on a routine basis, covering all of IPv4. And then we do web crawling, amounting to billions of requests issued per day. In terms of just the data that we've collected over time, it's over a decade's worth of history and amounts to petabytes of information that analysts can tap into. And so when we think about the types of data that's available to someone leveraging either RiskIQ's freemium services or enterprise services, they include things like domains, IP addresses, networking data, who-is information, SSL certificates, relationships within a web page, technologies that are running within a particular set of servers or infrastructure. All of that's available for use within our APIs or within our platforms. And so today, what we've put together with the playbooks, specifically around Microsoft Sentinel, is trying to bring more of that context and information directly to the incidents that are created within the Sentinel interface.
Thanks, Brandon. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, sure. Let me take control here. So I'm going to share. Oh, can you stop sharing for a moment, Jason?
Sure. There you go.
Thank you. So here we go. So we'll start with our first example here, which is just performing a demo of deploying a playbook itself. So for anybody who's not familiar, the GitHub repository for Azure Sentinel has a playbooks section. And if you go within that playbooks section, you'll see some information about deploying a playbook, including the steps on how to actually go about doing that. And then you'll obviously see the playbooks themselves. So anything that's prefaced with an enrichment or enrich point here and mentions RiskIQ is going to be something that is a RiskIQ playbook. For our demo, we're going to be looking at the IP passive DNS playbook. If you click on that playbook, what you'll see is just the author, the company, and then a little bit about the actual playbook itself. And you'll see these two helpful buttons here that are available. If we click on one of these buttons, what's going to happen is it's going to direct us over to the Azure portal to actually go and deploy this playbook. And so what we'll have available to us is a subscription, and then we're going to check the particular resource group of where we want to deploy this particular playbook. And in this particular case, we've already deployed a lot of the RiskIQ playbooks into our demo environment. So I'm going to give this just an alternative name. And this is not a requirement for filling in the username, but suggested to do this just in case you want to leverage that later on or want to see who's running the playbook. Once you agree to the terms and conditions, you can click purchase. There is no cost associated with this. Effectively, what it's going to do at this point is create a resource within your environment that will then become available within Sentinel. So if you're familiar with the Azure portal interface, this will look quite familiar to you. You'll notice that our deployment succeeded and that we've successfully deployed the RiskIQ IP passive DNS playbook. In order to access that, we can drill into Sentinel. We will select our workspace, and then we can go directly over to playbooks. And what we're going to see here is the playbook has already been enabled and it's available within our workspace. If I click on that particular playbook, one of the things that I'm going to need to do prior to leveraging it is actually configure some of the connectors involved. And so this is going to be indicated when you click Edit Playbook. You'll see these small little alert icons notifying that you have to make a connection. These connections will have to be set up from your actual portal interface. And some of these are a little bit buried, so we'll have to make sure that you get all of them. So in this particular case, there's a connection back to Azure Sentinel. And then within this for loop block, there's a connection to the RiskIQ connector that we have available to us. Once you've selected the actual connectors that you want to use with valid credentials, you'll then be in a state where you can save the playbook and then actually go about running it. And in terms of triggering the playbook, you can do so either manually, which there's a pattern for that if you wanted to test that. You could look at any incidents that are existing within your workspace today and choose to run a playbook automatically from there, or you could associate that playbook to an analytics rule. So let's, Jason, do you want to share back on the screen, or do we just want to keep going through in the demo and recap afterwards?
Yeah, let's just keep going on the demo and recap after.
Yeah, so once you have a playbook deployed, it's now available within your Sentinel workspace. And as Jason mentioned, there's analytic rules that there's a number of different templates that you can take advantage of. We've actually put together an analytics rule already inside of this inside of our workspace here. And what that's going to do is just look for particular activity that's associated. Oh, I'm sorry. It's in the wrong area here. So we have an analytics rule that actually uses the Custo query language to define what is going to be interesting and what should generate an incident.
Yeah, and this rule, while it has a different name than the template, is actually just the actual template that was built into the product by the Mystic folks. It's the map IP address, map IP indicator to Azure activity is what this template was.
Right, so we have a name, a description, a tactic that kind of falls within the kill chain, and then a severity associated with it, and a toggle for enable and disabling. If we go into the logic rule itself, this is going to become less important because it'll change by and large depending on the template that you're using or the particular rule that you're writing. But the important part here is really the automated response. So with this particular playbook, it has an IP address mentioned in it, and therefore the recent IP passive DNS playbook has it can be triggered within this particular playbook. And so in the event that this analytic matches something within your environment, you can then choose to automatically associate a playbook directly to the incident so that it runs automatically. So in this particular case, we've already associated the recent IP-passive-DNS playbook to here. So anytime this analytic runs and fires off any incident, this playbook will actually go and run along with it. And so let's take a look at what that actually produces within the Sentinel interface. So we can see here that we have a rule that, or we have an incident that matches that particular rule. And we can see that, it's new, it's unassigned, medium severity. That's what we classify within the analytics rule itself. And then right away, we can see that there's an IP address associated with it and a particular account. So in the last 30 days, we can also see this comment here as well. So what the comment is coming directly from our playbook. So what happened was the analytics rule triggered, it created an incident, the playbook ran, it extracted the IP address, which was this 40.65.216.30, and then pulled passive DNS information from the last 30 days directly from RiskIQ and associated it as a comment within our interface. Now, what's nice about this is that we can actually go and investigate the information. We can see a force graph here that's showing us a little bit of who's involved and the particular entity that's involved as well. If we wanted to, we could perform additional actions here. And then, as I mentioned, the comment shows up directly within this side panel. If I wanted to, I could click on that comment directly and then see it in full detail. The playbooks that RiskIQ has available from an enrichment perspective will sometimes bring in data so you can see it directly, get a preview of that. And in other cases, it'll just be a summary. So there's flexibility in how you get information into Sentinel and how much verbosity you want inside of that. So as an analyst, knowing what's really great about Sentinel and what's been created here is we had an analytics rule. It defined what it is that we were interested in. It ran. We found something that matched that particular rule. It's created an incident for us. Because of the playbooks, we automatically brought in context information from RiskIQ, giving me some sense of, this IP address may be suspicious. It's hosting some things that look suspicious. And now, as an investigator, I might want to go a step further and actually investigate this particular piece of infrastructure. And so RiskIQ has a community version of our product that's available. And if you were to run a search within your web interface for this particular IP address, you'd be presented with the RiskIQ screen that gives you access to all the information that RiskIQ has seen on this particular IP address and the ability to one-click pivot across all of the infrastructure that's associated with it. So as an analyst, my next steps might be to take a look more at these particular domains, see maybe where they're hosted, if they've changed any hosting providers, looking at the whois information of this particular IP address or the infrastructure that we're seeing here related to Facebook and Google and verifying your account. I might want to look at the technology that's available to us, et cetera, et cetera. As an analyst, my job is to try and build a story and identify if what I'm looking at is something that requires incident response or notifying a breach team that we might have an issue. And so all that information is available within RiskIQ, and we're just making it easier for the analyst by bringing it directly within Microsoft Sentinel. And with that, I think we can turn it back to the slides and kind of just recap what we covered here, from the deployment process to looking at the analytics rule and setting up an automatic playbook, to the output of seeing the data directly within the incident itself, to then potentially pivoting over to a system like RiskIQ to investigate it further.
Great, thanks, Brandon. I'm going to try to share. Why don't you? There we go. Zip past the demo. So what I wanted to talk about is just this kind of pattern that we showed today. I mean, I think it's kind of easy to gloss over, but what Brandon mentioned is that, you know, they've got petabytes of information and that you can tap into with this kind of pattern, this enrichment pattern using these playbooks. I mean, you could never import that in any SIM product or even hope to import a part of that data. So this pattern is really important for accessing these kinds of data sets that have been around for decades in some cases. And have just tremendous amount of information. But it's not limited to threat intelligence. I mean, this is a threat intelligence webinar for Azure Sentinel, but I did want to point out that this enrichment pattern for your analytics rules is perfectly applicable to lots of different scenarios as well. You can imagine a case where you'd want to enrich your security incidents with information from your own kind of business-oriented databases, like your HR database. I mean, maybe you want to pull in, or you know, your employee job title for a user that's been part of a security incident. You want to figure out where their physical location is, and what department they work for. Figure out if this is, you know, somebody who has keys to the kingdom, so to speak, or if this is just a, you know, frontline worker that doesn't have access to anything. You know, this is kind of information that your security responders would want to have at their fingertips when they open the incident the first time. And through this, you know, through the use of these playbooks, you can certainly quickly code up a playbook to call into your HR database. Your IT asset management system is another common place that you'd want to pull information related to your assets. You know, figure out what role this particular server has, for example, what data is on that server. What it's hosting, whether it's a database or a web server or what have you. Identity providers such as Active Directory can provide lots of things. You know, a picture of the user, can group memberships, permissions, roles that this person has, so you can figure out, you know, what level of access they have. If this is somebody involved in a security incident that has, you know, access to your Azure Key Vault keys, for example, you know, this is a lot more interesting than somebody else, perhaps. And I did want to mention that RiskIQ is actually working on new integrations related to their digital footprint. He and I, Brandon and I, have been talking about this for a while. RiskIQ has just a tremendous aperture of what your environment looks like from the outside. I mean, they're kind of, it's amazing the things that they can find out about your organization that you have hosted out on the internet that you didn't know you had. It's just, especially in this new world of cloud providers with Microsoft Azure, AWS, GCP, for example, you know, there's lots of different parts of your business are putting things out in the cloud that you may not be aware of as IT security professionals. And so RiskIQ has the ability to detect all of that and put it right front and center. So this is the kind of enrichment we're going to be working on next with RiskIQ. But I did want to point out that this pattern is applicable to lots of different things, not limited just to threat intelligence. So just to recap what we talked about today, and again, we have additional resources which will be on the next slide for this, but you know, bringing threat intelligence into Azure Sentinel, either through data platforms, threat intelligence platforms, or Taxi, using those built-in analytics that we provide to match your threat intelligence with your raw logs, leveraging these playbooks. Brandon showed you how to deploy them from GitHub, how to configure them with your analytics rules, simply checkbox, and then how to look at the enrichment within the context of an incident. And again, a reminder that you can use this pattern for other things besides threat intelligence as well. So with that, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. I know we have some Q&A time budgeted, so that's great. But I did want to leave you with some URL links. So RiskIQ, here's a URL you can go and sign up for their APIs. for the Azure Sentinel tech community. Hopefully you're already all aware of these things, but we do have a blog that we posted on this RiskIQ automated enrichment. We have kind of our master blog related to all things threat intelligence in the product. Walks you through importing data, walks you through how to use it, how to enumerate taxi server collections, etc. It's quite detailed. And then I mentioned earlier these Microsoft COVID-19 indicators. We're still publishing new indicators all the time on this feed. We have a blog about that with pointers to where to acquire the playbooks to import those threat indicators into Azure Sentinel. So Valan, do you want to share? Do you want me to stop sharing? How do you want to handle it?
You're fine. You're fine. And we have, before we go to the poll everywhere Q&A, just checking here because the folks here are helping with answering questions and it's going quite good. So I think we can continue with the poll EV. And let me just share my screen now. And thank you for that, Jason. Just a second. Okay, so basically the way this works, you follow the link just like it's the same link from the earlier survey, and then you input your question. And the good thing about it is that the folks can upvote or downvote. You'll have the thumbs up or thumbs down for the question. So let's just give it a minute for the folks to log in, and I will repost the link here in the chat room for the convenience. I meant to say submit your question, not your answer. Here we go.
The Microsoft TI service, the fabled Microsoft TI service. So, that's a fairly generic term. I have a suspicion, though, that the Microsoft TI service being referenced here is when would Microsoft Threat Intelligence be available, as in a Microsoft Threat Intelligence feed. This is a question we get asked a lot, so that's why I'm assuming that that's probably what is meant by this. So I can't share too much detail on that, as this is a public webinar, but we are definitely, I will say we are definitely working on it. I've mentioned that publicly in the past, so I don't think there's any harm there. I can't say when we are going to launch it. It will go through the normal channels, though, of private preview, public previews style cadence. So if you are interested in learning when the Microsoft TI feeds will become available, definitely join our Azure Sentinel private preview program, because that is where it will be announced first, and that's where you'll be able to get early access to it. And during private preview, you can imagine there will be no charges at all during private preview for sure. So that's what I'll say about the first question. Does Defender have the same access as to RiskIQ data without leaving the EDR? So Brandon, why don't you talk about, if you will, if you want to, talk about what you're doing with Defender ATP as next steps. I know you have something cooking there.
Yeah, so ATP does have a connector that can be taken advantage of within the logic apps. So it's very possible today to leverage RiskIQ data with ATP using just logic apps in general. So you can stitch those services together. In terms of just Microsoft Defender data and RiskIQ, today the approach that we'll be taking is getting the endpoint data itself within our analytics platform. So both Sentinel and ATP will be tabs within the RiskIQ passive total product for doing investigations. And you'll be able to see that information and pivot freely between all of the platforms. So today what we showed within Sentinel was bringing RiskIQ data and context directly into that system and then showing a pivot out to the platform. In the near future, you'll be able to see that Sentinel data within our platform, and you'll also be able to see the Microsoft Defender data as well. In terms of just, is RiskIQ a paid service? It is. It is a paid service, but there is a freemium model that we're fairly generous with. That's always been something when I founded the business, it was important to us to keep that. So if you sign up for a community account, you'll have free access to leverage that information. And in terms of pricing model, it's a combination of seats and queries, as you might expect. So the more users you have leveraging the product, the more that will cost, and the more you leverage and integrate the product from a data perspective, the more the price will go up there. But in terms of looking at other offerings in the market, I think it's very fairly priced. And that's always something that, again, we've been very cognizant of from the beginning of the company, is to create a fair price offering for the data that we've collected.
Just typing away at a question in the sidebar here. Let's see. How can I use custom threat intel on an overview map graph? So the way you'd want to do that, so in case people don't quite understand the question, there is, when you first launch Azure Sentinel, there's an overview tab. There's a map there of the world with some hotspots on it that are generated based on a query that we have in the product to look at your particular certain logs to see if they've been stamped with malicious IP addresses and the geo-IP information related to those. If you wanted to do something like that using your own custom threat intelligence, it's pretty easy to do. The way you do it is you go to workbooks and you create a new workbook, or you use an existing workbook like the threat intelligence workbook that's already there. We have a map control in workbooks already. So you'd write a query that basically takes your threat intelligence matches. So any alerts that you have, there's already a chart in the product, in the workbook, that says, you know, show me all of the alerts in the system that match my threat intelligence. Gives you a nice hierarchy of which indicators are most active in your system. If they're IP indicator, you can also match that with geo-IP data in the product to map it using the same query. So Azure workbooks, or Azure Sentinel workbooks rather, are the way that you would do this if you wanted to use your own data. Let's see. Does the API usage count against the overall API quota? API used by Sentinel. Yes, I think, Brandon, you'll probably be better to speak to that, but calls through these playbooks to the RiskIQ APIs, you know, you can speak to whether there's a quota there.
There is. Yeah, there's a quota. So if you're, if whatever tier you're in for the number of queries that you have, running these playbooks will impose, you know, a call there. And if you want to ascertain maybe how many calls would take place, you could simply look at the contents of the playbook through the edit view and see anytime that there's a call out to RiskIQ that will essentially function as a query. I don't really think it goes more than 8 queries per playbook. That's the maximum for if you're pulling in all of the summary information. And then we have a number of tactical playbooks that really only run 1 query. So it's, again, designed around some flexibility. If you want to pull in as much data as possible, you can. And if you want to just tactically pull in particular data sets, that's also available to you.
And you can control kind of the aggressiveness of the amount of calls you're going to make through these playbooks. In the analytic rule, Brandon didn't show it because it wasn't really germane, but there's a tab in there around the logic of the rule itself, the frequency with which it runs and everything. And one of the settings in there is around event aggregation and alert aggregation, meaning, how many matches does the analytic see before it produces a result, and then how many the grouping of alerts created by this analytic into incidents. So basically you can configure it such that, if you really wanted to be cautious about how much you were calling RiskIQ through these playbooks and didn't want to burn through your quota, you could set up some aggressive grouping such that, when the rule runs and fires and finds results, it would only do something like produce results or aggregate to an incident once per day, for example. So you can make sure that you're being modest and all the results get aggregated into a single incident. So it only calls once to RiskIQ. It will extract all of the IPs out of the incident. So if you have multiple IP results, it will use all of them and it will query RiskIQ for all the IPs in one shot. So that can help.
RiskIQ is available for Azure Sentinel customers of Azure Government Cloud. So the connector itself is fully deployed across all regions, and I will share, or I've responded within the Q&A just with the connector information, which shows where it's available.
Somebody's asking about the threat intelligence rules. Look for, you can search in your templates, so make sure you're not looking at active rules, but you're looking at rule templates. And when you're in rule templates, there's a search box. If you just type TI, like threat intelligence, TI space map, you'll see the only results that'll be returned are these 20 plus rules. You should see them all. Do the current playbooks import specific threat feeds? So the playbooks that we showed today are all about this new pattern related to enrichment. So it's not about importing data. Again, the data sets that we're tapping into here with RiskIQ are literally petabytes. So we wouldn't want to even attempt to import those into Azure Sentinel. So we're using a different pattern, an enrichment pattern. However, there certainly is a valid pattern of using playbooks to import threat feeds. You can see one of those on the Azure Sentinel tech community was written by some of our field support folks related to Alien Vault OTX, for example. There's a playbook you can simply download and import to import periodically any new indicators from that threat feed, assuming you have the appropriate API keys. So that's a pattern that you can reuse for basically any other threat source that is not supported by the TI platform's data connector or the Taxi Sticks data connector in the products today. Can we get somebody want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to add to that. In the process of trying to bring in more RiskIQ intelligence into Sentinel. It's not a completely vetted pattern, but we have been able to successfully leverage Azure blobs and reference those within Custo queries or analytics queries, so that in theory, if you had some of your threat intelligence within Azure blob storage, that you could reference that using a shared access token and use that within your Custo queries. So that is a slightly more technical way of importing the data, but it's another way, especially if you have a large amount of threat intelligence, where sticks could pose some difficulties.
The logic app JSON file, I think that is in the GitHub, is it not?
That's correct. I linked to it. From the Azure Sentinel GitHub page, if you click within playbooks, any one of the playbooks that are listed there, even beyond RiskIQ, will have a JSON file associated with them, specifically labeled Azure deploy.json. Clicking on that file, you can see the raw JSON information. In terms of deploying it, I think it's best to actually go through the deployment process that we showed today, just to avoid any errors or other issues in copying, pasting, or adjusting the JSON. Once you have the JSON and playbook implemented and it's a valid resource within the Azure portal, you can edit the playbook and you have the ability to see a visual editor, which is kind of what we showed today. And then you can toggle to a JSON view as well and see the actual content itself. So if you're looking to see that file, it's available in GitHub. If you've already imported the playbook, you have the ability to toggle that and see that JSON information directly from Sentinel itself.
Thanks, Brendan. The next question about can the playbook enrich any network observable noted in the environment? I mean, theoretically, sure. You could have an analytic rule that basically looks through any or all of your log data for network observables, and anytime it finds one, it could generate an informational level alert, for example, on that, where the analytic rule could then call out to RiskIQ and enrich that. I think you'd want to be cautious doing something like that. I think, you know, as we talked about quotas of API calls for RiskIQ, you would certainly be burning through that pretty quickly with this kind of pattern. You're going to have, you know, potentially millions of network observables depending on how much data you're importing into Sentinel. So use some caution there. Can we take network security group logs to Azure Sentinel? I'm pretty sure that network security group comes outputs to Azure Monitor. As almost every single Azure service outputs their logs through Azure Monitor, and Azure Monitor has an option to choose event hubs, blob data, or log analytics. And log analytics is the platform for Azure Sentinel. So you should be able to get your network security group logs into Azure Sentinel through Azure Monitor, choosing log analytics as the destination. Shane, if you have, or Chander, I see you're on the call too. If you guys have more information about that, feel free to jump in. Can it be integrated with log analytics? I'm not sure what it is in this case. Maybe a clarifying.
Could be the connector, maybe.
Maybe, yeah, maybe so. If the question is, let's just throw something out there and assume that this is what they're asking. The RiskIQ playbooks or any of these style of playbooks could absolutely be integrated with log analytics in the following way. Instead of outputting the enrichment to a comment in the incident, for example, which we felt was actually the best way to get the data in front of an investigator as quickly as possible. But if you wanted to, you could change the playbook such that instead of enriching through a comment, you could actually write the data to a table in log analytics. And these tables will be appended with _CL for custom logs, so you could name the table whatever you want. There is a log analytics data connector for Logic App playbooks already in the product, so it's fairly easy to take any data that you're retrieving from somewhere through a playbook and write it to log analytics using the existing Logic App playbook connector for log analytics. That would show up in Azure Sentinel. You could then use that table of enrichment data in new analytic rules, or you could reference it in other ways if you so chose.
Yeah, final top use cases question here. I know there's no votes, but I can answer this. So the top reason for integrating RiskIQ into Sentinel is really to bring context and to speed up your triage process. So Sentinel does a great job of really surfacing only alerts that are going to matter to your business or things that you define within the analytics available to you. And what RiskIQ is going to do is provide additional context around the indicators that are associated with that incident. And so by the analytics rule alone, you might be able to ascertain that you're dealing with something malicious right away. And you would still want RiskIQ context in order to figure out what other pieces of infrastructure are related to that observable, so that you can then proactively block them or look for those inside of your environment. So I'd say that's the top use case in the future of where we're going by bringing in digital footprint, is to provide visibility into your attack surface. And so not only will you be able to add context via data and the information that RiskIQ's collected, but you'll also be able to understand, is this one of the assets that I own on the internet? Are there potential vulnerabilities associated with it? What technologies is it running? And who's the owner of that asset? And so on.
Thanks, Brandon.
Well, thank you, Jason and Brandon. And just before wrapping up, I would like to remind folks that we have lined up webinars. Looks like September month is going to be these Sentinel month. We have about 6 or 7 out there. Anyway, we have scheduled webinars all the way till end of October, and you can visit us on aka.ms/security-webinars. So in case we missed to answer your question, which I believe we did all, and however, if you have additional questions, you can visit us. This is the Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. I would like to close this webinar by thanking Jason and Brandon for a fantastic presentation. And thank you to the rest of the team who helped answering the questions. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.